Breath of the Wild has been out for over 2 years now, and many people praise how good it is, how it's the best Zelda game ever, how it's the best game ever, and it's in fact sold more than any Zelda game ever. But personally, for me, it's not my favorite Zelda game ever. I want to start by saying Zelda is my favorite series of all time, and Breath of the Wild is an amazing game. Arlo did a review series on Zelda Breath of the Wild and had a quote that really made me want to make this video. He said, "Zelda means something different for everyone. Everyone has a different idea of what elements make a Zelda game a Zelda game. And it's a reason I love Zelda and why everyone has a different Zelda games that are their favorite." So anyways, I want to take it from there and talk about what aspects of Zelda are most important to me, and that will explain why Breath of the Wild is not my favorite Zelda game. But before we start, again, I want to say Breath of the Wild is awesome. It's a great game, even if it's not a great Zelda game. So let me explain. For me, the story and the gameplay are what make Zelda, Zelda. When I go back to replay Zelda games, it's because I want to experience the story again, or play through those awesome dungeons again, for the tricky puzzles, the unique enemies, and those epic boss battles at the very end of the dungeon. For Breath of the Wild, I don't see myself picking it up again for quite a while because these aspects are lacking compared to other Zelda titles in my opinion. The story in Breath of the Wild is told mostly through memories or flashbacks that Link has. Also, there's different books or diaries you can find on the map. There's NPCs that tell you certain things about the events of 100 years ago, and the game is more lore heavy than actual story and cutscenes throughout the game. It reminds me a lot of like Skyrim, since obviously that game was a huge inspiration for Breath of the Wild. So really, as far as like story cutscenes go, we only get the 18 memories as well as the 5 additional ones for the Champions Ballad. And my big problem with this is that, you know, we came off of a game like Skyward Sword where Aonuma and the team actually focused more heavily on the story for that game. The story actually came first and then the game came next. Where typically Zelda games, they create a game, it's a fun experience first, and then the story comes afterwards. So we came from a game that was so heavily focused on the story, and then Breath of the Wild doesn't really have a lot of cutscenes. So we kind of went from a game with the most cutscenes ever to a game with the least cutscenes ever. At least that's how it feels to me. And that's a problem for me because, like I said, story is a big part for Zelda for me, and if there isn't a big story focused on in the game, I lose a lot of interest in playing the game. And yes, I know there were some additional cutscenes, you know, with Impa and the ending and Cass and all that, but they're very minimal. And yeah, the ending, gosh, that ending and the boss battle were just not good, but I'm gonna get into that a little bit more later. But yeah, guys, so story-wise for me, it just really didn't do it for me. And I know a lot of people are not gonna agree with this, but it just, for me, it wasn't enough. The memories were cool, and I actually really liked the idea of memories and all that, but it just wasn't enough for me. I needed more. Now, getting into the gameplay here. Overall, we have 4 main dungeons, which are those 4 divine beasts. We have 120 shrines, plus we have DLC, which included the Master Sword Trials and the Champions Ballad. And the Master Sword Trials, actually, I want to say, was really good. It was seriously my favorite part of the game because it actually felt like a real dungeon, right? There was tons of different floors. You kept trying to progress through to the end, and it had a lot in it. It was probably if we consider it a dungeon compared to other Zelda games, it was the biggest one yet. And I really enjoyed that, and I wish there was more of that in this game. For me, the 120 shrines, yeah, I really did enjoy the shrines. I liked that they were kind of bite-sized, but I think there was a little bit too many, and I would have rather had maybe like half of those and then some bigger dungeons to kind of supplement those. Nothing ever really felt like a true Zelda dungeon to me, other than that Master Sword Trial. Even if all the pieces were there, from the shrines, the divine beasts, and everything. And those 4 main divine beasts, they weren't really Zelda dungeons. They were cool. They had their own gimmicks, which I thought were awesome. In Valruta, we had to move the trunk for the water to spray, and that would turn gears within the dungeon and also help us to progress forward. We had with Vametto, we were able to move the wings to kind of tilt the bird. Naboris, we were able to move those 3 main cylinders that were in the middle of the dungeon to change the room. And then Varudani, I think you also were able to just sort of rotate the lizard, And all these mechanics were just really cool. Like that was an awesome thing. It's just the dungeons weren't enough. These divine beasts were not enough. Those gimmicks were fun, but the rest of the dungeon was just really empty. They felt so empty to me. Compared to other Zelda dungeons of the past, there were no mini bosses, no dungeon keys, no key progression items, and even the bosses were carbon copies of one another and not really creative in their design. And that was really disappointing because Zelda has had some awesome bosses in the past. We had Kalakdos from Skyward Sword, where he was stuck in the middle of the ground at the beginning, swinging his massive arms, and you would pull his arms off with the key progression item in that dungeon, which was the whip. You'd pull his arms off, and then you'd hit him with his own swords, and then he would get up out of the ground and start running after you and attacking you. Then we had Stalord from Twilight Princess, where you were riding on the spinner, another key progression item for that dungeon, and you had to ride up that central pillar and run into the guy. Then you also had Twin Rova from Ocarina of Time, where you had to use the mirror shield to absorb their magic attacks and shoot it back at them. And I could just go on and on naming all these bosses. And the bosses in Breath of the Wild for these divine beasts, I'm probably not even going to remember because they just weren't really that special. Not to mention, there was also great mini bosses in Zelda games in the past. We had Gomez and the Garo Masters from Majora's Mask and the Stone Tower Temple. We had Don Goro from Twilight Princess, who was like that really awesome looking Goron who had like armor and stuff on him. And then, we've had Dark Link featured in Ocarina of Time and many other Zelda games. But you guys get my point. Like, these things did not exist, and that was really disappointing for me. Breath of the Wild just had an overall lack of enemy types as well. We had Bokoblins, and we had Lynels. I'm glad they returned because we haven't seen them in a long time. We had Lizalfos and a few others, but where were the Poes? The Wolfos, the Dekubabas, the Skulltulas, all the classic enemies we've come to know and love in the Zelda series just didn't exist. And I'd be fine if they would have introduced more new types of enemies, but they really didn't. I mean, we had Hinoxes, Guardians, the Yiga clan, the Taluses, which weren't really common enemies, but those were rather more like overworld mini bosses. I don't know, where were all these other enemies that we could have had? It was kind of cool to see the Zalfos and some of the other enemies have different elements attached to whatever region they were in, but I would have rather had actual different enemies. Either bring back some of the ones we've had in the past, or just make new ones. There just wasn't enough for me. I think there was just a lack of variety. Now, let me touch on the final boss battle in Breath of the Wild. Guys, it's not even close to battling that creepy weird Majora's Mask at the end of the Majora's Mask game, or battling Ganondorf and then finally Ganon in Ocarina of Time, battling that cool beast form of Ganondorf in Twilight Princess, and then battling him on the overworld of Hyrule, battling him on a horseback, and then finally having a one-on-one sword duel with him, and then Skyward Sword battling Girahim, and then finally Demise in this weird limbo place where he teleports you to and he's throwing lightning bolts at you. This final boss battle in Breath of the Wild just doesn't even come close. Basically, Ganon was no challenge after all the hype. You start the game with, the Calamity Ganon. He wrecked Hyrule 100 years ago. The world is left in destruction. People fear him. And you walk around all of the map in Breath of the Wild and you see all these ruins and just all this destruction, and even in some of the memories and cutscenes you see the guardians and things destroying everything, and then you finally get to Calamity Ganon and it's lame, it's easy, it's boring, it's not really that interesting. And when you finally get to the Beast Ganon phase where he's like shooting that big giant laser at you and you're riding on a horse, I don't even know if it's possible for him to hit you or even die. It's just so lame for me, guys. It just really didn't do it for me. And compared to other Zelda bosses, like, it just has to be one of the worst. But with that aside, let's start moving into some of the other gameplay elements. The quests in the game were actually pretty good, and especially the ones that involved the shrines, where you had to do something in order to unlock the shrine. Those were pretty cool, and I really enjoyed them, and there was quite a bit of them. If you got all the DLC, you even had all those extra quests to find the different gear that you could wear. But I still think it could have been better. I still feel like Majora's Mask does side quests the best of any Zelda game, in my opinion. Even if Majora's Mask probably had a lot fewer quests than Breath of the Wild. But again, my opinion. The reason I bring this up is because in Majora's Mask, you have the Bomber's Notebook, and you're able to actually track people over the different days, see where they are, what are they doing, and you had to do things at certain times to trigger events, and it just made it more immersive. You felt like you were part of Clock Town. You were helping people improve their lives. And in Breath of the Wild, it's kind of sad because I feel like they could have done this more, you know? Obviously, there were quests where you did do that, especially like Terry Town. That was one of my favorites. You actually got to like build a town. That was awesome. I just really wish, you know, there could have done more with quests where you were helping people, I think. As far as battling or fighting in Breath of the Wild, I also think this was pretty good, but again, it didn't really feel like Zelda to me. You know, there were no key items. How about the hook shot from Ocarina of Time? The beetle from Skyward Sword, or the gust bellows, or claw shots, even the bug catching net, which, you know, isn't great, but like that would have been awesome like in Breath of the Wild, because we already catch bugs in the game. How about a net to make it easier so we could not have to sneak up so close? Where were all these key items? They just didn't exist. You could even craft food, but where was the weapon crafting? We had all these materials and we couldn't really craft weapons. I know we could craft like some of those main weapons from each region, like the stone, I forget the name of the weapons, but like that stone crusher thing that you get from the Gorons, or like the trident that you get from the Zoras. I understand you could craft those, but you know, how about like a full crafting system to craft weapons? Obviously we could also craft potions and elixirs and everything, but I feel like Skyward Sword actually did this better. Again, my opinion, but in Skyward Sword, it was kind of a mix, right? Because at the time, Skyward Sword was probably the biggest change in the Zelda formula, right? Because in the game, yes, you did still have your regular items, but you were able to upgrade your items 1 or 2 times, and you were also able to upgrade your potions and everything. So I really would have liked in Breath of the Wild if we could craft weapons and then also upgrade them, and maybe still make them breakable, but make it so we could upgrade them to the point where they didn't break. And maybe it's only a few weapons, right? Like the Master Sword, it breaks, but we always have it. So maybe introduce more weapons like that where we can upgrade them and then maybe they just break, but then they sort of regenerate on their own. I just really would have liked that. I do think though the food and potions and elixirs in Breath of the Wild, crafting those was actually really good. I think that was a lot better than like Skyward Sword, and there was just more options in Breath of the Wild. But let's do that more with the weapons as well. Let's introduce some of that with there, because we're already collecting all these materials. How about musical instruments? I know some people don't really care for them in Zelda, but I loved being able to play the Wind Waker, the ocarina, even something as small as like the grass whistle in Twilight Princess. How about the harp in Skyward Sword? Every 3D Zelda game has had some sort of musical instrument or something, but Breath of the Wild doesn't have that. Also, all the other 3D Zeldas had some sort of time travel mechanic, and Breath of the Wild doesn't really exist. You know, in Ocarina of Time, you're able to travel backwards and forwards in time by 7 years at any time once you reach that point in the game. Majora's Mask, you're able to just keep reliving that same 3 days and travel back in time. Wind Waker, you're able to go into Hyrule Castle, the old Hyrule Castle, back in time. Skyward Sword had this as well a little bit with the Gate of Time towards the end of the game. But Breath of the Wild just had the memories, and why not let us play through some of those memories? A lot of them were so cool, where, you know, we'd see the Guardians like devastating like Castletown and all this stuff that was developed. Hyrule was just bustling with life, and you know, why not let us live through some of those memories? That would have been cool. I just feel like that was such a missed opportunity. Although Breath of the Wild being a good Zelda game is up for debate, there's no denying that it's a good game, period. I think this is just part of the magic of Zelda. Everyone plays for their own reasons, and that is why Zelda has such a diverse appeal. What I'm hoping for in the next Zelda is basically taking Breath of the Wild and expanding on some aspects, but also bringing back some of the old concepts, maybe in new and interesting ways. I just think they went a little too far and they just need to scale it back a bit. I could go on and on talking about Zelda as it's my favorite franchise of all time, but I want to continue the conversation with you guys in the comments below. So, is Breath of the Wild your favorite Zelda game? Why or why not?